I never imagined a single sentence could freeze an entire restaurant. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes and think about that night, I can still hear the sound of clinking glasses, the soft hum of violins, and the faint murmur of laughter that felt a little too polished to be real. It was one of those evenings that start like any other, ordinary, predictable, unremarkable, until something happens that rearranges the way you look at people, at privilege, at kindness itself. That night was supposed to be simple, just dinner, but instead, it became a story that changed me forever. A week before it happened, my friend Claire had called me, her voice buzzing with excitement. She worked for a well-known entrepreneur, a woman who was known across town not just for her success, but for her taste. She was hosting a private dinner, elegant, intimate, and selective. Claire said I'd been invited as a +1, which felt flattering in itself. I didn't move in circles like hers. My days were modest, my friends humble, and my world far quieter than the one I was about to step into. Still, I agreed, thinking it would be a refreshing change, maybe even a night to remember. When the evening came, I dressed as best as I could, choosing clothes that felt respectful but not extravagant. As I got ready, I heard a small knock on my door. It was my cousin Ethan, 7 years old, curious eyes, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. He'd been staying with me that week while his mother worked night shifts. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice full of innocent curiosity. I told him I was heading to dinner, and before I could even explain further, he asked if he could come along, just to see what fancy people eat. At first I laughed, brushing it off, but then I saw how earnest he looked. I hesitated. Part of me knew a place like that wasn't meant for children, but another part, the softer part, wanted to show him something special, something beyond his small world of cracked sidewalks and second-hand toys. Maybe, I told myself, it would be good for him. A little window into something different. The restaurant sat on the corner of a downtown street where the buildings gleamed like mirrors, and every car that passed looked too expensive to touch. I remember walking up the marble steps, Ethan's hand gripping mine tightly, his eyes darting in every direction, taking in the glittering chandeliers visible through the glass doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of vanilla and wine, the kind of scent that instantly tells you that everything here costs more than it should. The hostess stood by the entrance like she was guarding a secret. Her dress was sharp, her smile practiced, her posture flawless. The kind of woman who could say 10 things with just her eyes. Behind her, waiters glided like dancers between tables dressed in white linen, carrying trays of crystal glasses that shimmered under soft golden light. Laughter floated through the air, elegant, restrained, the kind of laughter that didn't quite reach the heart. Ethan's fingers curled a little tighter around mine as he whispered, "It's beautiful in here." I smiled, though part of me felt a faint tightening in my chest. I didn't belong here, not really, and neither did he. But I pushed that thought aside. I wanted him to feel that magic, even if just for one night. We walked toward the reserved table, and I could feel the glances before I even saw them. People paused mid-conversation to take in the sight of me. Simple dress, middle-class face, and a small boy in sneakers. They didn't say anything, but their silence said plenty. A woman in pearls lifted her glass slightly higher, pretending not to stare. A man in a tailored suit whispered something to his wife. I told myself it didn't matter. I kept walking. The room itself was stunning. High ceilings, slow music, and chandeliers that cast a soft amber glow on everything they touched. Every table was a portrait of perfection. Silver cutlery aligned, napkins folded like origami, glasses sparkling as if waiting for royalty. Ethan's eyes darted around in wonder. "Is this what rich people do for fun?" he asked in a whisper. I smiled and told him, "Something like that." We were almost there. I could see Claire waving at us from a table near the back, her face bright with recognition. Relief washed over me, a familiar face in a sea of strangers. I guided Ethan toward her, my pace steady but cautious, as though each step needed permission. The chatter resumed as if nothing unusual had happened, but that illusion would soon crumble in the span of one sentence. As we approached the table, the hostess stepped forward again, blocking our path with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I thought maybe she was going to check the reservation, or offer to take my coat, but instead, she looked directly at Ethan, her smile tightening, and her voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable edge. In that exact second, something in the air shifted. The sound of the violin seemed to fade, the laughter died mid-echo, and the warmth of the room turned into something cold and watchful. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, that invisible line between us and them, a line that I had unknowingly crossed the moment I brought a child into their perfect, manicured world. Ethan, still unaware, tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Can we sit now?" I nodded faintly, smiling to comfort him, even as a quiet dread began to form in the pit of my stomach. There was something in the hostess's eyes, not anger, but judgment, the kind of look that said without words, "You don't belong here." For a brief moment, I thought she might simply ask us to wait. Maybe she needed to confirm our table or check with the manager. But instead, her expression hardened. Her lips parted, and the words, "That left her mouth," were delivered so smoothly, so deliberately, that it took me a few seconds to realize what she'd just said. But nothing could have prepared me for what the hostess said the moment we walked in. Her eyes scanned the child like he didn't belong to this world. The sound of our footsteps against the polished marble echoed louder than it should have, as though the restaurant itself was announcing our arrival. The air was cool, faintly perfumed with the scent of roses and expensive wine, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that this night could still go smoothly. Ethan walked beside me, his small hand still clutching mine, his eyes wide with wonder at the chandeliers that sparkled like constellations above us. It felt almost unreal, like stepping into a place that existed outside of our ordinary lives, a world made of glass and silence, where even the air seemed too delicate to breathe too deeply. The hostess noticed us almost instantly. She was standing near the entrance podium, her posture perfect, her smile trained to perfection. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun, not a strand out of place, and her uniform looked like it had been tailored just for her. Everything about her screamed order, control, and quiet superiority. When her eyes met mine, she smiled politely, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a flicker of hesitation, the kind that's gone as quickly as it appears. But I saw it. I felt it. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and professional. "Do you have a reservation?" I told her the name under which the table was booked. She glanced down at the list on her podium, nodded briskly, and for a second, I thought that would be the end of it. She reached for 2 menus and motioned for us to follow her. I squeezed Ethan's hand gently, giving him a small smile of reassurance. He grinned back at me, excited, and whispered, "Do you think they have mac and cheese?" I chuckled quietly, telling him we'd find something just as good. But as we walked further into the restaurant, her steps began to slow. She glanced sideways at Ethan, her gaze sharp, analyzing him the way someone might inspect an item that doesn't quite fit on display. The warmth that had been in her tone only moments ago seemed to evaporate. She stopped abruptly halfway between the entrance and our table. Her smile faded, replaced by something tight, almost strained. Her eyes moved from Ethan's sneakers to his slightly oversized jacket, and then back to me. The pause stretched long enough for me to feel the shift in the air. Conversations around us softened, laughter dimmed, and suddenly I felt the weight of invisible eyes turning in our direction. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She tilted her head slightly, as if debating something in her mind. then lowered her voice just enough for me to hear, but loud enough for others nearby to notice. "I'm sorry, but that child can't sit here." For a split second, I didn't understand her. I thought maybe she meant there wasn't enough space at the table, or that she was referring to some safety rule, maybe a misunderstanding. But the look on her face told a different story. It wasn't confusion. It was certainty. It was judgment wrapped in politeness. "Excuse me?" I said softly, hoping I'd heard her wrong. She straightened her shoulders, her expression firm. "This is a private dining area. It's reserved for guests attending the dinner event. Children aren't allowed in this section." The words were precise, deliberate, delivered with the kind of calmness that only made them sting more. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. A couple at a nearby table paused mid-bite, their eyes flicking toward us. A waiter carrying a tray slowed his pace, glancing nervously between us and the hostess. Even the music, soft and distant, felt like it had faded away completely. I looked down at Ethan. His smile had vanished. His wide, curious eyes darted from me to the hostess and back again. "Why can't I sit?" he asked quietly, his voice small and uncertain. I could hear the tremor in it, the way embarrassment creeps into a child's words before they even understand what they've done wrong. I crouched down slightly, whispering, "It's okay, buddy," though I wasn't sure it was. I looked back at the hostess. "He's with me," I said firmly. "He's part of my invitation." She hesitated, glancing at her list again, as though looking for an excuse written somewhere in the ink. "I understand," she said finally, "but this section has a certain atmosphere we're expected to maintain." The way she said atmosphere told me everything. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about rules. It was about perception, about the kind of people she thought belonged in that room, and the kind she thought didn't. My throat tightened, but I tried to keep my voice even. "He's just a kid," I said. "He won't disturb anyone." Her lips curved into a polite smile that didn't match her tone. "I'm sorry, sir, but it's against policy." The way she emphasized "sir" made it sound like a final judgment. She might as well have said, "You don't belong here either." By now the whispers had begun, quiet but impossible to ignore. From the corner of my eye, I saw a woman lean toward her companion, murmuring something while pretending to sip her wine. Another man raised his eyebrows, watching with mild amusement. I could feel their gazes like heat against my skin. My hands started to tremble slightly, and I tried to hide it by tightening my grip on Ethan's shoulder. He looked up at me, his small face flushed with confusion. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice barely audible. That question broke something inside me. I wanted to protect him from this moment, to tell him that adults are fair and kind, that people don't judge others for where they come from or how much money they have. But as I looked at the hostess, standing there like the gatekeeper of some unspoken hierarchy, I knew that wasn't true. I forced myself to speak, to find the right words, but nothing came. The lump in my throat grew heavier. My silence felt like surrender, and yet, what could I say that wouldn't make things worse for him? My heart pounded, each beat louder than the one before. The hostess shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the attention had turned on her too. But instead of backing down, she crossed her arms lightly, trying to appear composed. "Perhaps," she said, "you'd prefer the family dining area. It's much more appropriate." Appropriate. That word hit like a slap. She wasn't just refusing service. She was reminding me of where she thought we belonged. Somewhere less polished, less expensive, less seen. Before I could respond, I felt a rush of heat rising through me, part shame, part anger, part disbelief. How could something as innocent as bringing a child to dinner provoke this kind of quiet hostility? The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but the sting in my chest wouldn't let me. The entire restaurant seemed to shrink around us. Every sound, every glance, every breath felt amplified. Ethan fidgeted beside me, his small voice trembling as he whispered, "Can we go?" I wanted to take him and walk out, to leave that place and never look back. But before I could move, before I could say a single word in response to the insult that still hung in the air like smoke, something unexpected happened. And before I could even react, someone from across the room stood up. It felt like every whisper in that room was about us. For a few seconds, I convinced myself I was imagining it, that the sudden drop in conversation, the faint rustle of silk, the subtle scrape of cutlery against porcelain were all just coincidence. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that the silence had weight. It wasn't just absence of sound, it was attention, focused, heavy, directed at us. Every face that had been animated moments earlier now seemed to turn in our direction, as though we had become the evening's unscheduled entertainment. I could hear the whispers before I saw the faces. Soft, clipped words exchanged behind raised hands and tilted wine glasses. The sound reminded me of paper tearing slowly. Small, deliberate, but impossible to ignore. Somewhere to my left, a woman in a shimmering blue dress leaned closer to her companion and muttered something, her lips curling in faint amusement. To the right, a man adjusted his tie and gave me a look that was neither curiosity nor sympathy, just quiet judgment. I felt my stomach tighten. Every instinct told me to turn around, take Ethan's hand, and walk straight out of that place. But when I glanced down at him, his expression stopped me. He looked so lost, so unsure, and his small fingers dug into my arm as though he was holding on to the last bit of safety he could find. I couldn't let him think he'd done something wrong. Not here. Not in front of them. The hostess, sensing that her first statement hadn't landed with enough authority, straightened her back and repeated herself, this time louder, her voice slicing through the silence. "I'm sorry," she said again, her tone slightly firmer now. "That child can't sit here." The words echoed, bouncing off marble and glass, magnified by the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a waiter paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue walking. A couple near the window exchanged glances, then quickly looked away as if pretending they hadn't heard. But they had. Everyone had. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, a flush of humiliation mixed with something far more dangerous, anger. My voice came out quieter than I expected, but steady. "And why is that exactly?" I asked. Her expression didn't change. "Sir, this section is reserved for guests of a certain standard. It's part of the event's policy." I repeated her word in my head. Standard. The kind of word that's supposed to sound professional, but really means something else entirely. It wasn't about policy. It was about people. The standard, she meant, wasn't written on any rule sheet. It was etched in the invisible language of class, of status, of who looks like they belong and who doesn't. Behind me, a man let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. I turned slightly, just enough to catch the smirk on his face before he looked away. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Ethan shifted closer to me, his small hand clutching at my sleeve now instead of my arm. His eyes darted nervously between the hostess and the tables surrounding us. I leaned down and whispered, "It's okay," though my voice trembled. He didn't answer, just pressed himself closer, as if he wanted to disappear into the folds of my coat. I looked back at the hostess, my patience thinning. "You're telling me that a child, well-dressed, polite, and invited as my guest, doesn't meet your standards?" She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but that was all it took for me to see the truth flicker across her face. A tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth, a flick of her eyes toward Ethan's shoes. It wasn't about him being a child. It was about what he represented to her, about what she thought people like us looked like. "I'm sure you understand," she said finally, still hiding behind that professional mask. "We have an image to maintain." An image, that was the phrase that sealed it. Every polished surface, every carefully placed orchid on the tables, Every whisper of luxury in that room existed to protect that image, an illusion of perfection that couldn't afford to be interrupted by something as real as us for a moment. I didn't know if I wanted to shout or laugh. The absurdity of it all. The chandeliers worth more than a year of my rent, the self-importance disguised as refinement. It all pressed against me, suffocating. But when I looked down and saw Ethan's frightened face, the anger melted into something quieter. I couldn't lose control. Not in front of him. The room had fallen almost completely silent now. The hostess was aware of it too. She shifted uneasily, her fingers gripping her clipboard a little too tightly. She was performing for an audience, and she knew it. The people sitting nearby were watching every movement, waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked entertained, others uncomfortable, but no one, not one person, spoke up. Ethan's voice broke the tension, so small it almost disappeared into the space between us. "Can we just go?" he whispered, his lower lip trembling slightly. I swallowed hard. I wanted to. God, I wanted to take him and walk right out, to find somewhere warm, somewhere human, where food wasn't served with a side of judgment. But something inside me stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the sudden realization that this moment, as humiliating as it was, wasn't just about us anymore. There are moments in life when you feel something changing even before it happens. A strange stillness settles in, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. That's what it felt like right then. A pause before the impact. My anger simmered beneath the surface, but so did a strange sense of inevitability. Something was about to happen. I could feel it. The hostess opened her mouth again, perhaps ready to offer another carefully worded explanation, but the sound that followed wasn't hers. It was the quiet scrape of a chair against the floor, deliberate, slow, and heavy with purpose. I turned my head toward the far end of the room. There, near the large window where the soft golden light met the night beyond, someone was standing. For a second, I couldn't tell who it was, only the outline of a figure rising with calm authority. The guests turned, too, the murmurs fading into silence once more. Every gaze shifted from us to the person now walking toward the center of the room. The click of heels against marble echoed like a heartbeat, slow, steady, unmistakably confident. Even before I saw her face, I knew. There was an energy to her presence, something that made people sit up straighter without realizing they were doing it. She moved with the kind of grace that comes from years of being watched, admired, obeyed. The hostess stiffened instantly, her back straightening like a soldier at attention. Her composure faltered for the first time. I saw her eyes widen slightly, her posture lose its sharpness, as if she knew the balance of power in that room had just shifted. My heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't from anger. It was from something else. Anticipation. That's when the rich woman herself entered the room. Her presence alone silenced the whispers. The moment she stepped forward, the entire restaurant seemed to inhale and hold its breath. It wasn't just that people noticed her. It was that everything around her changed because of her. The hum of conversation faded instantly. The waiters froze mid-step, and even the faint notes of the violin seemed to soften as if bending to her authority. I didn't know who she was at first, but I could feel what everyone else felt. The pull of respect, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. She moved slowly, deliberately, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that echoed like a metronome through the silence. The light caught the diamonds at her ears, but it wasn't the jewelry that gave her presence weight. It was her composure. She carried herself like someone who had never once had to raise her voice to be heard. There was something commanding, yet deeply controlled about her, a kind of grace that only people born to leadership seem to have. I noticed the hostess straighten instantly, her entire demeanor shifting from arrogance to nervous professionalism. The hand that had been resting confidently on her podium dropped to her side. Her chin dipped slightly, and her once perfect smile faltered as she tried to regain composure. The woman's eyes, sharp and perceptive, moved between us, the hostess, the child, and me. Though her expression remained calm, I could sense that she'd already pieced together more than she was being told. She didn't rush to speak. She simply observed, the silence stretching long enough for discomfort to start crawling under the hostess's skin. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but carried easily across the room. "What's going on here?" The question hung in the air like a quiet challenge. The hostess blinked rapidly, her confidence crumbling under the weight of that calm inquiry. "Ma'am," she began, her tone overly polite now. "There was just a small misunderstanding. I was explaining that this section is part of the private dining event. It's—" The woman raised an eyebrow, a small but powerful gesture that stopped her mid-sentence. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated softly. "With whom?" The hostess hesitated, her eyes darting toward me and then quickly away, as if looking at me too long might make her case weaker. "With this gentleman and his guest." The woman's gaze followed the gesture, landing first on me and then on Ethan. She looked at him quietly, her expression unreadable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, not from fear anymore, but from something heavier. The weight of all the eyes in the room, the unspoken verdict waiting to be delivered. Ethan stood still beside me, gripping the edge of my coat. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. For all his curiosity and bravery, he was still a child, and this moment was far too big for him. The woman's gaze lingered on him longer than I expected. There was something almost pained in her eyes, though I couldn't place it then. Finally, she turned back to the hostess, who stood rigid, trying to look composed but failing miserably. "Explain," the woman said. It wasn't a request. It was a quiet order that left no room for evasion. The hostess cleared her throat, her words tumbling out faster now. "I was just informing the guest that this section is reserved for certain attendees, and that the event tonight has a particular—" "A particular what?" the woman interrupted, her voice still calm but edged with steel. The single question sliced through the excuse before it could even form fully. The hostess swallowed hard. "It's an exclusive event," she said finally, her voice smaller now. "And we don't allow children in this area during such gatherings." The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at her for a long, heavy moment, the kind of look that forces people to confront themselves. Then she turned her gaze back to me. Her expression softened slightly, enough for me to breathe again. "You were invited to this event?" she asked gently. I nodded, my voice low but steady. "Yes. My friend Claire works for you. She said it would be all right if I came." "And the child?" she asked, glancing toward Ethan again. I hesitated, aware of how small he looked standing there amid so much luxury. "He's my cousin," I said. "He's been staying with me this week. I brought him along because I thought it might be something special for him. He's a good kid. He won't cause any trouble." For the first time since entering that room, the woman smiled. Not a big smile, not a performative one, but something genuine and fleeting. It softened her entire face. She looked down at Ethan, who was trying to avoid eye contact, and asked in a voice gentle enough to surprise everyone nearby, "What's your name, sweetheart?" Ethan hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan." "That's a strong name," she said quietly, the corners of her mouth lifting again. "Nice to meet you, Ethan." The exchange lasted only seconds, but it was enough to change the air in the room. The tension didn't vanish completely, but it shifted, like the first crack of sunlight breaking through a storm. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it, that maybe the awkwardness would fade, and we'd finally be allowed to sit and blend back into the background. But the woman's expression changed again, and I realized the calm wasn't relief. It was focus. She had understood exactly what had happened, and now she was deciding how to respond. The hostess, still standing a few steps behind her, shifted uncomfortably. She must have known what was coming, though she kept her face fixed in a practiced mask of professionalism. I saw her glance nervously towards the nearby tables, where guests were still pretending not to listen. The woman turned slightly toward the hostess, her tone even and deliberate. "So, if I understand correctly," she said, "you stopped one of my guests at the entrance because the child he brought didn't meet the standards of this room?" The hostess froze. "Ma'am, I didn't mean it like that." "Then how did you mean it?" The woman's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The softness made it more cutting. The hostess stammered for a response that wouldn't come. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. I could see the faint tremor in her hands, the crack forming in her carefully polished demeanor. The woman looked at her for a long time, her gaze unwavering, sharp, assessing. The silence was unbearable, the kind that stretches until it forces truth into the open. Ethan shifted closer to me again, his small voice barely audible. "Is she mad at us?" I bent down slightly, whispering, "No, buddy, not at us." The woman's eyes flicked toward us briefly, and I saw the faintest flicker of empathy, or maybe recognition, pass through them. It was like she was looking not just at a child and his guardian, but at a memory. Something unspoken connected us in that instant, though I didn't yet know what. When she finally spoke again, her tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Say it again," she said, her eyes never leaving the hostess's face. The hostess blinked. "Ma'am?" "Repeat what you just told them," the woman said quietly, each word deliberate, precise, impossible to ignore. The air around us tightened, as though the entire room leaned in closer to hear what would happen next. Then, in a voice calm but sharp, she asked the hostess to repeat herself. Her voice carried the kind of anger that made everyone stop breathing. The woman's question cut through the room, like the clean strike of a blade. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. There was something about her tone, steady, precise, and heavy with restrained fury, that stopped every other sound in its tracks. It was the kind of voice that carried not just authority, but moral weight. Even the waiters, who had been trying to move discreetly between tables, froze mid-step, holding their trays as if afraid that the slightest clink of glass might draw her attention. The hostess's confidence, once polished and professional, seemed to crumble beneath that single question. Her posture stiffened, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it wavered. I just meant that—" The woman took a slow step closer, not intimidating, but undeniably in control. "Say it again," she repeated, her tone deceptively calm. "What did you just say about the child?" All color drained from the hostess's face. She glanced around, as if searching for help, but no one dared to move. Every pair of eyes in that dining room was fixed on her, waiting. She swallowed hard and stammered, "Ma'am, I was only trying to explain that this area is reserved for certain guests." The woman tilted her head slightly, one eyebrow arching just enough to make her look both disbelieving and dangerous. "Certain guests?" she asked softly. "Guests like who exactly? People like me?" The question landed like thunder, even though it was spoken barely above a whisper. The tension in the room thickened. It was no longer just discomfort. It was judgment turning inward, forcing every person present to look at themselves. The hostess's lips parted again, but no words came. Her eyes darted helplessly toward the onlookers, then back to the woman, who stood there with her hands folded lightly in front of her, composed yet unyielding. I didn't mean it that way," the hostess managed, her voice trembling. "Then how did you mean it?" the woman countered, her voice cutting through the air with scalpel-like precision. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you told one of my guests that his child isn't worthy to sit at a table in my restaurant." You could hear the collective exhale of the crowd, the sound of people realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. I stood frozen, torn between awe and disbelief, watching as the woman dismantled the hostess's arrogance with nothing but composure. The hostess tried to compose herself, her hands trembling slightly. "I was just trying to maintain the standard of the event," she said weakly. The woman gave a cold, mirthless smile. "Standard," she repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "That word again. Such a convenient shield for cruelty, isn't it?" The hostess opened her mouth to respond, but the woman raised a hand gently, silencing her without needing to say another word. The gesture wasn't harsh. It was effortless, natural, and absolute. Then, turning away from the hostess entirely, she shifted her focus to me and to Ethan. The anger in her expression faded, replaced by something softer, something deeply human. She took a slow breath and said, "Tell me, who is this child?" Her voice, though gentle, carried a kind of weight that made honesty unavoidable. I could feel my throat tightening as I tried to find the right words. "He's my cousin," I said finally. "He's been staying with me for a while. His mom works nights, so I look after him when I can. I brought him tonight because he's a good kid. Polite, quiet, and I thought it would be nice for him to experience something special." The woman listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she turned her attention to Ethan. He was standing very still, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. His eyes darted nervously between her and the floor. She crouched slightly so she could meet him at eye level, a gesture that carried more grace than most people could manage standing tall. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked softly. He hesitated before answering, his voice small but clear. "Ethan. Ethan," she repeated slowly, as if memorizing it. "That's a strong name." He nodded, unsure of how to respond, his cheeks flushed. She smiled, not a broad, performative smile, but a quiet, kind one. "It's nice to meet you, Ethan," she said. Then she straightened, her face thoughtful. She looked at me again, and though her expression was calm, her eyes told a different story. There was recognition there, not of me, but of something in the situation, something familiar that stirred an old memory. I didn't know what it was, but the emotion flickered across her features like a shadow. The room remained silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock near the bar. No one dared to move or speak. Even the hostess had gone completely still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting for the woman's next words. The woman took a step back, glancing once more between the child, the hostess, and the surrounding crowd. Her expression had changed now, the initial fury tempered by something deeper, more reflective. It wasn't just about a rule broken or a policy misused. There was something personal in the way she looked at Ethan, something that made her posture soften slightly, her voice quiet but deliberate. She took another breath, her eyes never leaving the hostess. "You know," she said slowly, "it's strange how quickly people forget what it feels like to be on the other side of judgment." The hostess looked up, her lips parting to speak, but the woman wasn't done. She continued, her tone now both calm and cutting. "You wear your uniform, your name tag, and you think it gives you the right to decide who deserves a seat and who doesn't. You call it maintaining standards, but really it's just fear. Fear of being reminded that the world doesn't always look as perfect as this room." No one moved. The tension had shifted again, from discomfort to reflection. I saw it in the faces around me, the realization creeping in, the guilt, the quiet shame. Ethan squeezed my hand tightly, and I bent down slightly, whispering, "It's all right?" He nodded, though his wide eyes stayed locked on the woman who had just turned an entire dining room into a courtroom without raising her voice once. She glanced back at us then, and her expression changed once more, softer, warmer. "Don't be frightened," she said to him quietly. "You've done nothing wrong." The way she said it, gentle, deliberate, almost maternal, made something inside me ache. It wasn't just kindness. It was recognition. She looked at him like she saw a reflection of something she had once been. Her attention returned to the hostess, One final time. And her tone hardened slightly. "There's something you need to understand," she said. "This restaurant, this event, this image you're trying so hard to protect, it means nothing if it comes at the cost of decency." The hostess lowered her gaze, shame creeping up her face. The woman sighed softly, not out of frustration, but out of disappointment. Then she turned toward Ethan once more. Her eyes softened completely, and her next words carried an emotion so unexpected that it made every person in that room lean forward, breath held. Then she said something that changed the mood of the entire room. Her story changed everything I thought I knew about her. When the woman finally spoke again, her voice was quieter than before. Not weak, but weighted with something that made everyone listen. She didn't look at the hostess this time, nor at me or Ethan. Her eyes drifted slowly across the room, sweeping over the guests who had fallen completely silent. It was as if she wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, and yet somehow she was speaking to all of us. "You know," she began, her tone soft but steady, "I've spent most of my life sitting in rooms like this, polished, elegant, filled with the sound of laughter that doesn't quite reach the heart. But there was a time when I couldn't even step into a place like this." No one moved. Even the waiters stood still, their trays lowered slightly, as if afraid the sound of glass might interrupt her. "I was born a few blocks from here," she continued. "Not in a high-rise apartment or a house with a garden, but in a small, cramped building above a grocery store. My father worked double shifts at a factory, and my mother cleaned offices at night. They did everything they could to keep food on the table, but luxury was something we saw only through windows." Her eyes softened as she spoke, but her voice carried an undercurrent of pain. "When I was about his age," she said, nodding toward Ethan, "my mother saved up for weeks to take me out for my birthday. She'd been talking about it for days. Said she wanted me to see how the other side lived. So she took me to a restaurant not half as beautiful as this one, but at the time, it felt like stepping into another world." She paused, her gaze distant now, caught somewhere between memory and ache. "We walked in wearing our Sunday best, clothes she had ironed 3 times to make sure they looked neat. But the moment we stepped through the door, everything changed. The music didn't stop, but it might as well have. The hostess, she looked us up and down and told my mother, in that polite, quiet way people use when they're trying to sound kind, that there were no tables available. The room was completely silent. No one dared to breathe. She didn't even check," the woman continued softly. "Didn't look at her list, didn't ask how long we'd wait, just decided we didn't belong. My mother apologized, and led me out as quickly as she could. We walked back home in silence. I remember watching her from the corner of my eye and seeing the tears she was trying to hide. That night, she said something I'll never forget. People will always see what they want to see." Her voice caught slightly, but she steadied it. "That was the first time I felt small. Not because of who I was, but because someone else decided I should be." She looked around the room again, meeting the eyes of her guests one by one. "Years passed. I worked, studied, climbed my way up until people started inviting me into places that once turned me away. But that moment never left me. It became a wound, small but deep, that never fully healed. Every time someone looked at me with that same quiet judgment, I felt it reopen." Her gaze drifted back to the hostess, who stood frozen, her face pale, her posture rigid. "When I finally had the chance to build something of my own, I made a promise to myself that no one would ever be made to feel what I felt that day. Not in my presence, not under my name. This restaurant," she said, gesturing around the room, "was supposed to be that promise." The words landed with devastating clarity. You could almost hear the collective heartbeat of the room shift. Guests who had been watching silently now lowered their eyes, the weight of guilt pressing on their shoulders. Some looked down at their plates. Others fidgeted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet her gaze. The woman who had laughed earlier now sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable but ashamed. I felt my throat tighten. Her story hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just her pain she was describing. It was a reflection of something I had felt my whole life. That quiet sense of being measured, of being compared, of being seen through the lens of what you have instead of who you are. I glanced down at Ethan, who was watching her with wide, unblinking eyes, too young to understand the weight of her words, but somehow still affected by them. The hostess stood motionless, her clipboard hanging loosely in her hand. The artificial confidence she had worn so proudly earlier had completely vanished. In its place was a look of shock, not because she'd been caught, but because she'd been reminded of something she'd long forgotten. Empathy. The woman took a slow breath, her voice softening again. "We build these beautiful places," she said, "and convince ourselves that elegance and kindness can't exist in the same space. We forget that luxury doesn't make us better. It only makes our mistakes more visible." Her words rippled through the room like a quiet storm, the kind of truth that leaves no one untouched. I felt something shift inside me, admiration mixed with guilt, sorrow, and gratitude. I had come here expecting an evening of fine dining and polite conversation. Instead, I was watching a woman use her voice to dismantle the very foundation of the world she had built. She stepped closer to the hostess now, not with anger, but with a kind of calm authority that was far more powerful. The poor woman didn't dare look up. Her knuckles were white from gripping the edge of her podium. The rich woman paused, her gaze lingering on her for a long, deliberate moment. The room waited, hanging on the silence that stretched like glass about to crack. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, her words chosen with precision. "You thought you were protecting the image of this place," she said, "but you were betraying the very reason it exists." The hostess blinked rapidly, her voice barely audible when she spoke. "I didn't know." "No," the woman interrupted softly. "You didn't care to know. That's the difference." The words landed heavy, but they weren't cruel. They were simply true. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with realization. Even the chandeliers seemed to glow a little dimmer, their brilliance muted by the weight of truth that had settled over everyone present. Ethan tugged lightly at my sleeve, whispering, "She sounds sad." I nodded, unable to speak. Because he was right. Beneath all that composure, beneath the authority and wealth, I could hear the sadness in her voice, not the sadness of anger but of disappointment. She turned away slightly, her eyes sweeping the room one last time before settling back on the hostess. There was no fury left in her expression, only quiet resolve. And then, she took one step closer, her heels barely making a sound, and said the words that would decide everything. Then the woman turned to the hostess and delivered her verdict. Her declaration echoed louder than the hostess's insult. The silence that followed her story was the kind that could swallow sound. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than any scolding could ever be. Every guest, every server, every lingering whisper seemed to have dissolved into nothing. It felt as though time itself had stopped inside those golden walls, waiting for her next move. Then she turned her gaze back to the hostess, calm, unwavering, deliberate. Her voice, when it came, was not raised, yet it carried through the room with a power that silenced even thought. "Bring another chair," she said clearly. "This child will sit beside me." The statement struck like thunder in a clear sky. It was simple, only 7 words, but the meaning behind them rippled through the air like a wave crashing against marble. The room collectively gasped, a small sound, but it carried an entire spectrum of disbelief, admiration, and shame. I felt my breath catch. Ethan, still clutching my sleeve, looked up at me wide-eyed, as though unsure whether he had heard correctly. The hostess stood frozen. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked once, twice, her mind clearly scrambling for a response that could justify her earlier cruelty. Her hands trembled against the edge of her podium. Every trace of superiority had vanished, replaced by the pale flush of humiliation. The woman's expression didn't change. She simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked on the hostess. "Did you hear me?" she asked softly, her tone even but cutting. "I said bring another chair." Still, the hostess didn't move. Her pride, or perhaps her shock, kept her rooted to the floor. The rich woman's eyes narrowed, her calm now sharpened by impatience. She spoke again, this time with a firmness that left no room for hesitation. "Now." The single word carried such command that it reverberated through the space. A waiter, sensing the gravity of the moment, hurried forward before the hostess could even react. He pulled a chair from a nearby table and placed it beside the woman's seat. The sound of the chair legs against the marble floor seemed almost symbolic, a scraping away of every pretense that had filled that room moments earlier. The woman turned to Ethan, and, with a warmth that seemed to melt the cold air around us, extended her hand. "Come here, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was different now, softer, tender, the way someone speaks when they want to make the world less cruel for a child. Ethan hesitated for a second, looking up at me for reassurance. I nodded faintly, still too stunned to speak. Slowly, he took her hand. She smiled, and in that small gesture there was something disarming, something that cut through all the judgment, all the artificial grace that surrounded us. She guided him to the seat beside her and helped him climb up onto it. Then she looked at him as though he were the most important person in the room. "There," she said gently. "Now we can all enjoy dinner properly." For the first time since we had arrived, Ethan smiled, a shy, uncertain smile at first, but it grew the longer she held his gaze. The fear that had been etched into his face melted away, replaced by something brighter, something that looked a lot like pride. The transformation in the room was palpable. The same guests who had moments earlier watched in silence now sat with their eyes lowered, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The woman in pearls who had been whispering earlier now stared fixedly at her glass. The man who had laughed under his breath kept his head down, pretending to inspect his plate. It was as though the entire room had been forced to confront its own reflection, and none of them liked what they saw. The woman leaned back slightly in her chair, still holding Ethan's small hand in hers. "There's a saying my mother used to tell me," she said quietly, though loud enough for everyone to hear. "If a place doesn't have room for kindness, it doesn't deserve to be called beautiful." Her words lingered in the air, sinking deep into the uncomfortable silence. No one dared move. Even the soft lighting seemed to bend around her, as though acknowledging that this was her space, her truth, and everyone else was merely a guest within it. I stood there, watching the scene unfold, my emotions a tangled mess of gratitude, admiration, and disbelief. The power of her gesture was so simple, yet it carried more meaning than any lecture could. In a single moment, she had restored dignity not only to Ethan, but to everyone who had ever been made to feel lesser by the weight of another person's judgment. Ethan glanced up at her shyly and said, "Thank you." His voice was small, but it broke through the silence like light through fog. The woman smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "You earned that seat just by being who you are." It was such a small act, pulling up a chair, offering a smile, yet it changed the entire atmosphere. The room that had once felt like a monument to exclusivity now felt human again. The coldness of the marble floors, the shine of the chandeliers, the glimmer of silver and glass, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the quiet strength of what had just happened. The hostess still hadn't moved. She stood there, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. You could see the realization dawning on her, the shock of recognizing her own cruelty in front of a room full of witnesses. Her pride, her poise, her practiced smile, All of it had dissolved under the weight of the woman's compassion. I could feel the tension radiating off her, the kind of panic that builds when someone is forced to confront a truth they've spent their life avoiding. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but there was nothing left to say. The woman's simple act had already spoken louder than any reprimand ever could. I felt Ethan's small hand tug at mine. He looked at me with wide eyes, as if seeking to understand what had just happened. I smiled faintly, bending down to whisper, "You did nothing wrong, buddy. You just reminded everyone what right looks like." The woman overheard me and gave a small nod of agreement. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I saw something deeper: understanding, shared experience, and a quiet acknowledgement of what this moment meant. The dinner resumed slowly after that, though it wasn't the same. The chatter was subdued, the laughter softer, as though everyone was afraid of shattering the fragile decency that had just been restored. But in that stillness, in that new calm, something remarkable had happened, a shift that no one could unsee. Ethan sat proudly beside her, his shoulders a little straighter, his smile a little wider. The woman poured him a glass of water as if he were a distinguished guest, asking him about his favorite foods and favorite books. Every small gesture, every word she spoke, was an act of quiet rebellion against the prejudice that had tried to define the moment. I watched, unable to stop the tightness in my chest from turning into tears. This wasn't just about a chair. It was about worth, about humanity, about the reminder that decency doesn't need wealth to exist. It only needs courage. And as the evening settled back into an uneasy calm, something unexpected happened. The woman's words had begun to heal one part of the room, but for another, they had just opened a wound. But then something unexpected happened. The hostess broke down. Her arrogance shattered faster than the silence she'd created. The first tear fell so quietly that at first no one noticed. The hostess stood there, rigid as a statue, her hands trembling slightly against the side of the podium, her face pale under the soft amber light. For the first time that night, her flawless mask, the one built of poise, confidence, and control, began to crack. Her breath hitched, uneven, as her eyes darted from the woman to the guests, then to the small boy now sitting proudly at the table. Her chest rose and fell too fast, and then, all at once, she broke. It wasn't a graceful kind of crying, not the composed kind that people can hide behind with dignity intact. It was raw, unfiltered, and human. The kind of crying that comes when you realize too late how wrong you've been. Her voice came out in a whisper at first, shaky, as though she was trying to speak through the weight of her own shame. I'm sorry, she said, the words almost swallowed by the silence of the room. I didn't mean to be cruel, I swear I didn't. I just thought I was doing my job. The words trembled as they left her mouth. Her hands lifted halfway, palms open, pleading for some kind of understanding that she no longer believed she deserved. She looked at the woman, not the powerful figure she'd just defied, but the person she had hurt without even realizing it. I thought, she continued, her voice cracking, that this place was meant for a certain kind of people. That's what I was told when I started. That's what I was trying to protect. I didn't mean to humiliate anyone. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to. The crowd, moments ago filled with whispers and stiff postures, now sat in stunned silence. No one moved. No one dared interrupt what was happening. Even the servers, who had tried to remain invisible all night, stood frozen near the walls, their faces reflecting something new. Not judgment, but empathy. The woman didn't speak immediately. She let the moment breathe, let the weight of the hostess's confession settle like dust after a storm. When she finally did speak, her tone was soft, almost maternal, but her words carried a gravity that couldn't be ignored. Your job, she said, isn't to judge. It's to serve with kindness. The hostess's shoulders shook as she nodded, tears streaking down the carefully applied foundation that was now smudged beyond repair. "I know," she whispered. "I see that now. I just wanted to do things right. I thought this was how it was supposed to be done." The woman's expression softened. "That's what so many of us tell ourselves," she replied. "That cruelty is just policy. That indifference is professionalism. But that's not what this place was built for." The hostess covered her face with both hands as a soft sob escaped her lips. The sound broke something in the air. The stiffness, the hierarchy, the invisible line that had separated us from them. I watched as the guests who had once looked down at their plates began to raise their eyes, some filled with guilt, others with quiet compassion. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into something else. Something tender. Something redemptive. Ethan, sitting beside the woman, looked around in confusion. To him, this was just a lot of adults trying to understand things that didn't make sense. He leaned closer to me and whispered, "Is she sad because she was mean?" I nodded faintly, whispering back, "Maybe. Sometimes people only realize how wrong they were after they see the hurt they caused." The woman overheard, her eyes flicking toward us for just a second before turning back to the hostess. "Do you know," she said softly, "what I see when I look at you right now?" The hostess shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, ma'am." "I see myself," the woman said quietly. "Many years ago I made mistakes like yours. I thought success meant being untouchable, that kindness was weakness. I built walls around myself so high that I couldn't see who I was hurting on the other side. But walls don't protect dignity. They just block compassion." The hostess's tears flowed freely now. Her voice trembled as she spoke again, her words halting, broken. "I don't know how to fix this." The woman took a step closer, the sound of her heels soft against the marble. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet every word was crystal clear. "You already have," she said, "because you're standing here, facing what you did, instead of hiding behind excuses. That's where change begins." The hostess covered her mouth with her hand as another sob escaped. The sight was painful to watch, but also strangely beautiful, a proud woman unraveling into honesty. The guests, too, seemed transformed. A man at the corner table discreetly removed his napkin and dabbed at his eyes. A woman near the bar leaned into her husband's shoulder, whispering something that sounded like, "Can you believe this?" But not in mockery, in awe. The room was no longer filled with discomfort. It was filled with reflection. Every person there seemed to be confronting a piece of themselves in that moment, a time when they had turned away from someone, or stayed, silent when they should have spoken. The woman took one last step toward the hostess. The distance between them was small now, only a few feet, but filled with all the lessons and regrets that years could carry. Her tone was kind, but her words were unforgettable. "Remember this feeling," she said softly. "Remember what it's like to realize you've hurt someone who didn't deserve it. And before you ever look down on anyone again, remember what this moment feels like." The hostess nodded through her tears, her face flushed with remorse. "I will," she whispered. "I promise I will." Then, for the first time, the woman smiled, not a triumphant smile, but one of grace. "Good," she said simply. "Then this moment wasn't wasted." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not of gossip this time, but of understanding. A few people began to clap softly, hesitant at first, then more firmly as others joined in. It wasn't applause for spectacle. It was appreciation for honesty, for humanity restored. The hostess wiped her tears and stepped back, her expression still trembling but lighter somehow, as if the act of being seen, truly seen, had set her free. She whispered another apology, her voice hoarse but sincere, and then stood silently, her gaze lowered in gratitude and shame. The woman turned back to her table, her poise intact, but her expression tender. She reached for her glass, but before she could lift it, a small voice broke the silence, high, gentle, and pure in its innocence. And then, the child said something that made even the woman tear up. Sometimes it's the smallest voices that carry the biggest truths. For a moment, the room felt suspended in a fragile stillness. You could hear nothing but the faint clinking of glass and the uneven rhythm of breath as people tried to absorb what had just unfolded. The woman was still standing near the hostess, her expression calm, but filled with quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from having carried too much truth for too long. The hostess stood bowed, her tears still fresh, but her pride surrendered. And then, in that thick silence, came a sound so soft, so unexpected, that it made everyone lift their heads at once. It was Ethan's voice. He had been sitting quietly the entire time, his small hands folded in his lap, watching the exchange with eyes that saw more than any adult realized. His voice was gentle but carried perfectly across the room. "You're really kind," he said, his tone pure, untouched by the weight of adult understanding. "My mom says kind people are rare." Every conversation that might have started, every shuffle or breath or whisper, simply stopped. It was as though the whole restaurant had frozen to make space for his words. They were simple, innocent, but they struck deeper than any sermon or speech could have. The woman turned toward him, her face softening immediately. The composure she had worn like armor, for most of the evening, began to dissolve. Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Her eyes shimmered, catching the glow of the chandelier above as she blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a very long time." Ethan tilted his head, confused by her emotion. "It's true," he said simply. "Mom says being rich doesn't make you special, but being kind does. And you're really kind." The woman gave a small, shaky laugh, the kind that breaks through a lump in the throat. Then she lowered herself gracefully, kneeling down beside him so they were eye level. It was a gesture that carried more weight than any grand statement. In a room built on hierarchy, she was lowering herself to meet a child, not as a superior, but as an equal. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're a very wise young man," she said softly. "Your mother raised you well." Ethan smiled shyly, ducking his head a little, and for the first time that night, his face was completely at ease. The fear, the confusion, the discomfort, all of it melted away under the warmth of her words. I could feel my throat tighten as I watched the scene unfold. There was something profoundly humbling about it, the way the evening had begun with arrogance and exclusion, and yet, somehow, through honesty and innocence, had transformed into something almost holy. Around us, I noticed the change ripple through the guests. The tension that had bound everyone so tightly began to ease. Shoulders relaxed, faces softened. A woman at a nearby table wiped a tear discreetly with her napkin. A man who had earlier scoffed quietly now sat with his hands clasped, his gaze lowered in thought. The waiters who had once watched nervously now stood with faint smiles, as though silently rooting for what they were witnessing. The rich woman looked around the room, still kneeling beside Ethan, and said quietly, "We often think kindness is a small thing, something we give when it's convenient. But it's not small, it's everything." Then she stood, straightened her posture, and reached for her glass. The crystal caught the warm light as she lifted it slightly into the air. "To kindness," she said simply, her voice steady and strong. "Not to wealth, not to success, not to status, but to kindness, because it's the only thing that lasts." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, as if moved by something deeper than habit, glasses lifted all around the room. The sound of crystal clinking filled the space, gentle and sincere, followed by a soft murmur of agreement. "To kindness," several voices echoed. I lifted my glass, too, my fingers trembling slightly. As the rim touched my lips, I felt something stir inside me. Gratitude, admiration, and a quiet sense of awe. I had come expecting a simple dinner. What I had found instead was a reminder that decency, though often hidden beneath layers of pride and pretense, still existed, and when it surfaced, it could change everything it touched. The woman sat down again, motioning for Ethan to eat. "I hope you're hungry," she said with a warm smile. "I hear they make a mean pasta here." Ethan laughed softly, nodding. "Can I get extra cheese?" he asked innocently. She chuckled, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that seemed to surprise even her. "You can have as much cheese as you want," she said. "Tonight you're my special guest." Around us, the mood had transformed entirely. The laughter that returned to the room wasn't hollow or performative anymore. It was real, unguarded and warm. People spoke again, but now there was no sharpness, no undertone of superiority. Conversations carried gentleness. Smiles were genuine. For the first time that night, everyone felt equal. Even the hostess, standing near the entrance with her tear-streaked face, seemed lighter. Her eyes glistened, but her posture was softer. Humbled, yet peaceful. She looked like someone who had been broken open just enough to let the light in. The woman leaned closer to Ethan as he began to eat, watching him with the kind of care that made my heart ache. There was something maternal in the way she observed him. Not pity, but affection. As if his words had awoken a tenderness in her she hadn't felt in years. As for me, I could barely take my eyes off her. The transformation was extraordinary. The woman who had entered this story as a symbol of wealth and refinement had revealed herself to be something infinitely rarer, human in the truest, most compassionate sense of the word. And through her actions, through her humility, she had restored something that had been quietly broken inside me for years. Faith in people. The dinner carried on quietly after that. Dishes were served, laughter resumed, and for the first time, the restaurant felt alive in the way it was always meant to be. Not as a showcase of power, but as a place of connection. I sat there in silence for a while, my heart heavy and full all at once. Then, as the evening began to wind down and the last of the plates were cleared away, the woman turned to me. Her eyes, still shimmering with the emotion of the night, met mine. There was a softness there, but also something deeper, the look of someone who carried a truth too important not to share. She smiled faintly and said, "Stay after dinner. There's something I want to tell you." But what she told me after dinner stayed with me for life. It wasn't just dinner anymore. It was redemption unfolding in real time. The energy inside the restaurant had changed so completely that it felt like stepping into another world. The air, once thick with tension and silent judgment, now carried a quiet warmth, like the hush that follows a storm. The laughter that returned was softer, sincere, stripped of the arrogance it once carried. It wasn't the laughter of superiority or performance. It was the laughter of people who had just been reminded of something important, their own humanity. Ethan sat beside the woman as though he had always belonged there. His small frame looked almost fragile against the grandeur of the dining table, yet somehow his presence gave the room a grounding honesty it had lacked before. The woman leaned toward him, her voice gentle, her attention unwavering. "So, tell me," she said with genuine curiosity. "What do you like most about school?" He hesitated, glancing at me as if to make sure it was okay to answer. When I nodded, he smiled. "Math," he said proudly. "But sometimes it's hard." "Everything worth learning is," she said with a small smile. "But I bet you're good at it." He shrugged shyly. "My teacher says I ask too many questions." The woman laughed softly, a sound so pure that even those nearby couldn't help but smile. "That's the best thing a teacher can say about you," she told him. "Curiosity means you'll never stop growing." He grinned, and for a brief moment I saw a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The light of being seen, not as a burden, but as someone worthy of attention. I sat quietly, watching them talk. Each word between them felt sacred, a quiet exchange between two souls at opposite ends of the world, yet meeting perfectly in the middle. Around us, other conversations had resumed, but they carried a different tone now, one of softness, of humility. People weren't talking about business deals or luxury vacations anymore. They spoke of family, of memories, of the little things that once seemed too ordinary to mention. It struck me then how quickly cruelty can turn into compassion, how a single act, a few words spoken with conviction, can shift the direction of an entire evening, perhaps even an entire life. I found myself wondering how many of the people in that room had gone their whole lives without being challenged, without being reminded that wealth without warmth was just another form of emptiness. The hostess continued to move quietly around the tables, her earlier confidence now replaced by careful humility. Her steps were slower, her voice lower. Every time she poured a glass or set down a plate, she did so with the reverence of someone who had been forced to see their own reflection clearly for the first time. Once, she approached our table, hesitant, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled the water glasses. When her eyes met mine, I saw an apology there that needed no words. She glanced toward Ethan, who looked up at her with the open innocence only a child can hold, and she managed a faint, grateful smile. The woman caught the exchange and gave the hostess a small nod of encouragement. Not superiority, but grace. It was forgiveness in motion. I looked around the room again. Every face reflected some version of the same emotion, reflection, remorse, relief. The woman's story, her compassion, her humility, it had changed the tone of everything. Even the chandeliers seemed to glow differently now, their golden light warmer, softer, as if the entire space had been reborn under a new kind of illumination. The dinner continued. Plates arrived, dishes clinked, and servers moved with quiet precision. But no one seemed to care about the food anymore. The evening had become something bigger than the menu, bigger than the event itself. It had become a testament to what happens when truth meets grace. Ethan chattered happily as the woman asked about his favorite books, his friends, his dreams. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" she asked, cutting into her food, but keeping her eyes on him with genuine interest. He thought for a long moment. "I want to build things," he said finally, "like houses or maybe schools. My mom says some people don't have homes, and I want to make them." Something flickered in her expression. Pride, admiration, maybe even longing. "That's a wonderful dream," she said. "And you'll do it. I know you will." He smiled, the kind of smile that carries a promise with it. Across the table, I watched her closely, studying the subtle emotion behind her words. There was something deeply personal about the way she listened to him, as though he reminded her of something, or someone, she had lost. For a brief moment, her gaze drifted away from him and into the distance, her expression softening into something sad and unguarded. I didn't ask. Some silences don't need to be broken. The night wore on, and though the dishes came and went, the focus never shifted from that moment, from her act of kindness that had redefined everything. Guests who had arrived as strangers began to talk to one another as equals. Even the servers were drawn into light conversation, their nervous professionalism replaced by something resembling pride. It wasn't just dinner anymore. It was connection. It was redemption unfolding in real time. At one point, I caught myself staring at Ethan, watching the way he spoke to her, how easily, how naturally, and a realization settled in my chest like a quiet truth. He would remember this night for the rest of his life, not because of the chandeliers or the expensive food, but because someone who had every reason to look down on him chose instead to lift him up. When dessert arrived, a delicate slice of cake draped in ribbons of caramel, the woman insisted Ethan have the first bite. He looked hesitant, glancing at me again, but she laughed. "It's okay," she said. "You've earned it." He took a bite, his eyes lighting up instantly. "This is the best cake ever," he said, his voice full of pure joy. Her laughter joined his, and the room joined in, a shared smile spreading like light. For the first time that night, there was no pretense left. Every barrier had been stripped away. I felt something stir deep within me, a realization so simple yet so profound that it made my eyes sting. This woman, this one act, had reminded every person in that room of who they truly were beneath the layers of wealth, insecurity, and pride. She had reminded us that dignity doesn't come from where we sit, but from how we make others feel while they're sitting beside us. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests began to leave, the woman's attention turned to me. Her expression softened, her smile carrying a quiet kind of knowing, as though she could already sense the gratitude swirling in my chest. She reached out and placed her hand lightly over mine. "Stay after everyone leaves," she said softly. "There's something I'd like to tell you." Later that night, the woman asked me to stay after everyone left. Her words that night became a compass for my entire life. When the last guest had gone, and the soft hum of conversation faded into the quiet rhythm of closing time, the restaurant felt different. Still warm, still elegant, but stripped of its earlier grandeur. The chandeliers above cast softer light now, almost intimate in its glow. The air carried the faint scent of extinguished candles and dessert wine, mixed with the subtle aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ethan had fallen asleep against my arm, his head resting gently on my shoulder, his small frame heavy with the weight of exhaustion and contentment. The woman sat across the table, her posture relaxed, her expression reflective. She had taken off her diamond earrings, placing them beside her glass, as though shedding the last symbol of formality. What remained wasn't the powerful businesswoman everyone feared and admired. It was someone entirely human, someone raw, open, and deeply thoughtful. "I'm glad you stayed," she said quietly. "I wanted to talk to you without all the noise." I nodded, careful not to wake Ethan. "Of course," I said softly. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did tonight. You didn't have to do any of that." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "I had to. If I hadn't, I'd be no different from the ones who stood by and said nothing." Her words lingered, sharp yet gentle, cutting straight through the silence. I watched her carefully, waiting, because I sensed she wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the table. "There's something you should know," she began, her voice lower now, steadier. "When I was younger, I learned the hard way that silence is the most dangerous form of approval. When you see something wrong and say nothing, you become part of it, whether you meant to or not. It's easy to stand up for yourself. It's much harder to stand up for someone else. But that's what separates people who exist from people who live." I felt those words hit something deep inside me. I thought back to how close I had been to walking away, to taking Ethan's hand, and leaving quietly to avoid the scene. The thought of it made my chest tighten with guilt. She was right. Silence would have made me complicit. "I didn't really do anything," I said, my voice quiet, almost defensive. "You're the one who stood up." Her eyes softened, but her expression remained firm. "No," she said. "You stood by him. You didn't rush to leave. You didn't hide him behind you. You stood there, in front of a room full of people who wanted you to feel small, and you didn't let go of his hand. That matters more than you think." I looked down at Ethan, still sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and soft. She was right again. I had stayed. Maybe I hadn't spoken up loudly, but I hadn't abandoned him either. She reached for her glass, took a small sip, and set it down carefully. "Do you know why I built this restaurant?" she asked. "It wasn't just to serve good food. It was to serve a reminder that grace and luxury should never cancel out humility. Too many people think kindness is weakness, when in truth, it's the strongest force we have." Her gaze grew distant, her tone softer now. I've spent years in rooms filled with people who wear their wealth like armor. They think it protects them. But really, it only isolates them. When you start believing you're better than the person serving you, you've already lost the only thing that makes you human. I nodded slowly, each word sinking deeper. You really believe kindness can change people? I asked quietly. She smiled, not with optimism, but with certainty. It already did tonight, she said. Did you see their faces? The silence? The way the laughter came back different? It's not always loud, but kindness has a way of echoing long after cruelty fades. Her eyes flicked toward the empty tables, her voice growing almost wistful. The truth is, I didn't speak up tonight just for you or that child. I spoke up for the version of myself that was turned away all those years ago. The little girl in the cheap dress who learned that the world can be cruel, but also that it doesn't have to stay that way. The weight of her story pressed against my chest again. She had turned her pain into purpose, her wound into a doorway for others. And somehow, in doing so, she had given all of us a piece of that redemption. For a moment we sat in silence, both lost in our thoughts. Then she leaned forward again, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. There's one more thing I've learned, she said. Ego destroys empathy faster than anything else. People who see the world through the lens of pride can't recognize kindness. They mistake it for weakness. But ego only builds walls. Kindness tears them down. I looked up at her, meeting her gaze fully for the first time that night. That's beautiful, I said softly. She smiled. It's true, she said. And it's the only reason I'm still standing here instead of becoming like the ones who once humiliated me. I could have spent my life chasing revenge or proving I belong. But what's the point of success if it costs you your soul? Her words sank into me, heavy and illuminating all at once. I thought about all the moments in my life when I had stayed silent, when I had watched unfairness unfold and told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I had always thought that not participating made me innocent. Now I realized that it only made me invisible. She stood then, gathering her things slowly. Promise me something, she said. Anything, I replied. If you ever find yourself in a room like this again, she said, and you see someone being treated the way that child was, don't look away. Don't wait for someone richer or braver to speak first. Use your voice. Because that's what real privilege is, the ability to speak for those who can't. I nodded, my throat tightening. I promise. She smiled softly, placing her hand briefly over mine. Good, she said. Then you'll never forget this night. For a long moment we just sat there, the sound of the city faint through the glass, the lights dimming one by one as the staff began closing up. It felt like time itself had slowed down to let the words settle. As I stood to leave, Ethan stirred, blinking up sleepily at me. I whispered, "It's time to go, buddy." He rubbed his eyes, glancing toward the woman. She smiled at him one last time, that same gentle, glowing smile that had changed the entire night. "Thank you," I said again, my voice thick with emotion. She nodded. "Don't thank me. Just remember." Outside, the night air was cool, the city alive with quiet noise, cars, laughter, the hum of life moving on. But inside me, something had changed forever. Her words kept replaying in my mind, clear and unwavering, like a compass pointing north through the fog of everything I thought I knew. Money builds walls. Kindness tears them down. Years later, I saw someone who reminded me of that night. I almost didn't recognize her, but she remembered me instantly. Years passed, as years always do, quietly, almost unnoticed, until you look back and realize how far you've come. Life moved on, yet some nights refused to fade. That dinner, that woman, that single sentence that split the air like lightning, it stayed with me, an echo that never quite left. It became a compass, guiding how I looked at people, how I raised Ethan, how I carried myself when the world tested my patience. I'd find myself replaying her words whenever I saw someone being dismissed or ignored. Money builds walls. Kindness tears them down. It was a gray afternoon when it happened, the kind of day that carries a certain melancholy, neither warm nor cold, just caught, somewhere in between. I was driving back from work, hunger gnawing quietly in my stomach, when I noticed a small diner tucked between two old brick buildings. The paint on the sign was fading, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. Something about it felt comforting, ordinary, human. I pulled over, deciding to step in for a cup of coffee and maybe a bite to eat. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. The smell hit first: brewed coffee, pancakes, the faint sweetness of syrup. The chatter was low, unpretentious, filled with laughter that felt real, not rehearsed. The kind of place where no one cared about your clothes, your job, or the number of zeros in your bank account. And that's when I saw her. At first, I didn't recognize her. She stood behind the counter wearing a simple uniform, light blue with a white apron, her hair tied back loosely, a few strands escaping around her face. She was pouring coffee into a customer's mug, smiling, not the polite, tight-lipped kind of smile that hides judgment, but a genuine one that reached her eyes. She laughed softly at something the man said, then thanked him warmly before moving to the next table. There was something about her movements, a grace that was familiar but softer now, unburdened. It took a few seconds for memory to catch up with recognition, and when it did, my heart gave a strange jolt. It was her, the hostess. The same woman who, years ago, had told me that Ethan couldn't sit at a table meant for certain guests. The same woman whose arrogance had cracked open under the weight of truth and compassion. But this wasn't her anymore. At least not the version I remembered. This woman radiated warmth, humility, and peace. I must have been staring longer than I realized, because when she turned and our eyes met, her expression changed instantly. For a split second, confusion flickered across her face. Then, her mouth parted in surprise, and her eyes filled with recognition. She set down the coffee pot slowly and walked toward me. "Sir," she began, her voice soft, hesitant but certain. "You were at that restaurant, you and the little boy." I nodded, smiling. "You remember?" Her eyes glistened, and she laughed lightly, shaking her head. I could never forget. We stood there for a moment, both caught in the strange stillness of recognition that bridges years like they were never there at all. Then she motioned for me to sit in one of the booths near the window. "Please," she said, "let me bring you something. On the house." I wanted to protest, but something in her tone told me it wasn't about generosity. It was about closure. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, she set one in front of me, then sat across from me, her hands clasped together on the table. Up close, I noticed the lines on her face, not the hard lines of stress and pride I remembered, but softer ones, carved by time and humility. "I think about that night often," she said quietly. "I used to wish I could forget it, but now I'm glad I can't. It changed me." I didn't speak. I just listened. She smiled faintly, glancing down at her hands. "After that night, I quit my job. I couldn't stand being there anymore. I realized I'd been living in a world built on image and exclusion, where kindness was treated like weakness. I wanted to start over somewhere smaller, somewhere real." I nodded, a small lump forming in my throat. "So I came here," she continued. "This diner was hiring. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay much, but it feels right. The people who come here, they're just people. No one cares if you wear a watch that costs a month's rent. They care if you smile, if you listen." She paused, her eyes meeting mine again. "That woman, the one who defended you, she taught me something I'll never forget. She showed me that one moment of compassion can erase 1,000 acts of indifference. I've tried to live by that ever since." I sat back, taking in her words, feeling something shift inside me again. A quiet gratitude, almost like relief. It was one thing to believe in change, but another entirely to see it. Breathing, real, sitting across from you in a diner booth. Ethan must be grown now, she said, smiling. He was such a sweet kid. He's in college, I said proudly. Studying architecture. He wants to build homes for families who can't afford them. Her eyes softened, tears threatening again. Of course he does, she whispered. That makes perfect sense. We talked for a while longer, trading small stories about life and time and the strange ways people cross paths only to find each other again when it matters most. Before I left, she reached across the table, placing her hand lightly over mine, a gesture so similar to the one that woman had once given me. I never got to thank you, she said softly. You could have yelled that night, made a scene, but you didn't. You stayed calm, and that gave her space to teach me the lesson I needed most. You were part of that change. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. She was the one who changed everything. She smiled. Maybe, but sometimes kindness needs witnesses to keep it alive. As I stepped outside, the afternoon had turned to evening. The city lights flickered on one by one, washing the street in a warm glow. The diner's windows reflected the world outside, cars, people, movement. But inside, the memory of that conversation lingered like the last light before dusk. I stood there for a moment, looking through the glass at her. This woman who had once symbolized everything wrong with privilege and now embodied the quiet beauty of redemption. It made me realize something profound, that compassion doesn't just heal those who receive it. It transforms those who learn from it. As I walked away, I couldn't help but smile. Life had a way of circling back, of reminding us that even the smallest moments can ripple outward far beyond what we ever imagine. And in that moment, I understood why that night had never left me, why it never would. Because it wasn't just a story about humiliation or redemption. It was about humanity, flawed, fragile, but capable of incredible grace when given the chance. And that's why I'll never forget the night someone said, "That child can't sit here." If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were in that restaurant. Your thoughts matter more than views. They build the kind of kindness this world needs.